Good afternoon. So we are going to start our second session today. It is called Uniformity and Contradiction, playing in the Soviet city, between internationalism, regionalism and colonialism. So referring to this title, I wanted to touch upon several issues. And in particular, one pavilion that we organized last year, together with Georg Schollhammer. This was Armenian pavilion. And this pavilion touched upon different modalities in architecture and urban planning. Armenia has had it for more than 100 years because it tried to develop conflicting languages and also new aesthetic and social visions, and as well as political visions. So political visions and ideas about the future of society's development can help us to observe how those contradictions were demonstrated in different architectural plans, different designs and sketches that actually created quite big gaps in collective identity. So the logics of those gaps can be seen in the development of city planning in different cultural areas in all Soviet republics, despite the differences in context, background, motivations, and specificity of the context. The Khrushchev started very severe and tough planning economics, and this economy was often associated with the new form of colonialism, the ideological principle of Soviet culture. Started working in different ways because it was related to vertical control of different areas, including architecture and urban planning. So the process of social and cultural individuation that started in the 60s happened differently in different republics, identifying different logical and art correlations, especially if we refer to the periphery and the center of influence. So the factor of national and ideological doctrine allowed different opportunities for republics between very strict and severe norms and requirements and their own views. So, and if we take a look at political and economic sphere, we can see there are different propositions related to locality, different cultural specifics, and cultural determinism and preferences, positioning themselves as anti-colonial, nationalistic discourses. Contrary to internationalist trends in architecture and urban planning. Very often in such republics, those decolonization tactics actually continued the history by deconstructing experiments of narrative nature. But it's very interesting to see how peripheral architecture continually experimented with the development of new thinking and how it influenced the architectural situation of the center, so-called center. And I would like to introduce the speakers that we're going to have during the second session. First of all, Boris Chukhovich. He is a historian of architecture, museum work and international curator, and works with Montreal University. He has participated in all conferences that were organized as part of local modernity and Soviet modernism. Then the second speaker is Jean-Louis Cohen, who is a historian of architecture working at New York University of Fine Arts. He's also a curator, and I'm sure that you know him very well. And the third speaker is going to be Wolfgang Kiel, who is a journalist and historian of architecture. And we have worked with Wolfgang for a long time. We have professional relations, and we have had it since very early days of our research project, because Wolfgang participated in this process as a researcher. So I would like to give the floor to Boris now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruben, for your introduction, and I would like to thank everyone for coming. I'm very happy that you came here to listen to our panel discussion. I'm going to start reading the text because I want to formulate my ideas very quickly. And when I speak about the East, I always say it in the quotation mark. So I'm not going to repeat that. I mean quotation mark, or the East using the parenthesis. So the Soviet experience, both critical and apologetic, is focused on its unique character. And I want to show the modernity of Soviet East can be compared with other parts of colonial and post-colonial world. And it was actually part of it. And it influenced on what happened in the center of the country. I already mentioned that architecture of Middle East it was about a combination of Orientalism and modernism. And modernism was about universality, and Orientalism was about exotization of the other. So the architects found themselves in a double-bind situation because there were contradictory requirements from the professional community and the society. Very often they used commentary as a way out. So they followed the logic of modernist form, but then the other things were dependent on the discourse available at that time. So, and that's how the modernist projects came to the society. So I would like to show you that the pseudo-Eastern periphery did not exist in vacuum, but it was part of the global processes. After the war, the problem of European countries were similar to the colonial Soviet world, because they were in crisis, lots of destruction, they had to restore the economy, and there were very expanded programs of mass production, mass construction. So we can see projects in Casablanca between 51, 55, then Chandigarh, at the same time the first complexes of social housing in Algiers in 1953, and then the Assembly in France made a decision to start massive construction in 1953 in France. Then micro districts began to be built in Germany and Bulgaria, chronologically speaking, these cheap housing projects began to be built in the periphery in the developing countries, and then it would move on towards the center. And the same trends can be found in the Soviet architecture. By the 50s and 60s, the urban planning situation in large Asian cities resembled colonial architecture, because the cities remained bipolar because they were centers of old medieval cities and neighborhoods. And on the other hand, they started developing European districts with people coming to Middle Asia after the Russian colonization. And the same was true in Morocco, Tunisia, India, and Egypt. But the Soviet authorities aimed at different tasks. The colonial authorities wanted to focus on segregation, trying just to soften it at times, whereas the Soviet authorities wanted to demolish those borders, to eliminate the colonial binarity and a total merging of Russian and Asian communities. The general plan of Asian cities were focused on those ideas. The binary structure had to give way to homogeneous structure of new neighborhoods and quarters. So they built neighborhoods according to European images with hierarchical structure of self-government, and we should move from modern ornamentalism as domes and decorations, and towards the theory as a new movement, and we can see radical expression of such constructions. Orientalism in art and painting embodied images of East for European customer, and we have to understand the internal contradictory character of Soviet trend, because they saw the differences between the East and the West, but on the other hand they saw the East as a plastic substance that had to be transformed according to Moscow's ideas. So the residential housing construction was not priority. So the idea about the radical reconstruction of the cities in the East came aboard only in Khrushchev's time. So they started building typical neighborhoods in Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, and to evaluate the specifics of Soviet policies. It has to be compared with the post-colonial and colonial societies of that time, and not the Soviet construction norms. So new districts in Morocco and Algiers are marked by segregation. So in Casablanca, architects declared that they wanted to build housing according to the ideology of three main religious groups, Jews, European, and Muslims. So they wanted the buildings to light from above, and so you couldn't see anything what happened inside from the street, because the Muslim houses were quite closed. So Jewish society was sort of transient, semi-Eastern, semi-Western. And so this type of segregation was criticized by Muslims. The political leaders found it inadmissible to construct Europeans their way of life according to the mentality. And the same segregation principles can be found in Algeria. And the liberal part of French elite tried to find the consensus between colonized and the colonizers. So they wanted to build districts where both Arabs and Europeans lived, and the structure remained binary structure. So they built the standard one-story buildings for Muslims and high-rises for others. And in other cases, Fernand Couillon in Dar el Mansoul, in the northern part, he put Europeans in the north and Muslims in the south. and the square, the area was different. So, for example, for Europeans, 60 square meters with a living room, kitchen, and sleeping, and for Asian, it was a smaller area, 30 to 40 square meters, with just wash basins and some basic facilities. So segregation became softer later on, even though while maintaining the privileges and preferences for European citizens. And after Europeans left, more well-to-do social layers of the former colonial society began to live there. Because the Muslims' residential facilities went towards poor people, and Chandigarh looks like that because the housing with very basic facilities was designed for workers. And as far as I understood from the previous speaker's report, in Kabul they also wanted to build cottages for certain groups of people, and Khrushchev small apartments for others. The Soviet city in the east had a dichotomy, and so they had laborers and women of the east, and also brotherly Russian proletariat, those that people were exiled or sent there. But the architects wanted to build a uniform, homogeneous environment for all. So we can't really imagine specially designed buildings for people from Turkmenistan or Jews. So there were some little differences in these buildings, but this policy of radical equality was a form of domination. Grigory Revzin uses the terms and says that this was Russia's journey this meant the destruction of the system of the social relations in historic cities, and replacing it with the textures that would be more Russified, more controlled, and more transparent, so that it would be easier to control it by the Soviet system. So it was not symmetrical. One community had to play according to the rules of the other party brought from the center. And beginning with the 60s, we can see different trends. They had their own social context, because there were different groups in the Soviet society. So the elite people didn't want to live in workers' neighborhoods. So according to the requirements, Soviet architecture and art had to be national in their form. So this aesthetic imperative led architects to move from radical uniformity. And that's why next to the standard housing that was produced for people, we can see some experimental housing following communist rhetoric that created environments for new elite groups. They try to interpret it in two ways, through climatic conditions and national psychology. Even though they thought that the climate had predetermined the national identity, this was not obvious, because two communities continued living there, because one of them identified it with Asia in the east, and the other one with Russia and Europe, and that's why architects looked at Madrid and India, because its modernity really marks about the interest towards different ethnic identities.
Everything started with climate. Well, working with climate was built in sort of two register. Either you could get adopted, or developing having a tradition, it could be changed. Well, change of climate in Asian and mid-Asian countries was planned by massive watering of the arid territories. Also, what's interesting, in Kabul, in the previous administration, there were also the same reservoirs between housing quarters. So I wouldn't stipulate on this utopian plot because I already had publicized the text of visualization of Asian towns. Simply want to emphasize that massive watering was introduced into housing quarters with pools and reservoirs, with streams, like some kind of classical Garden of Eden, both in Muslim as well as in the Soviet mythology. It was the image of the future communist paradise. As for adaptation of climate or climate change, well, there were several directions. Also, they've been working on buildings, with heat protection qualities and also such specific something, ways of protecting, like, sun protecting grills and pergolas within grants. Also, well, system of circulation of air. Back in '67, architect Yuzovsky in Dushanbe, and Andrei Kaczynski, who is present here in Tashkent, well, formulated very original approaches to airing of traditional, housing buildings. So, in more practical mass construction, mid-Asian houses were equipped with castor lodges. And the theme of adaptation to national psychology becomes, quite evident in late 60s and broadly popular in 70s. Well, architects returned back to the traditional Muslim house with its concentration around the internal courtyard. So, under this pretext, the central districts of cities, now built out with two-story cottages, declaratively what was built for, children with lots of children, but in reality it was inhabited by the political elite or higher level economies. So this way the hierarchy was forming up like colonial Algeria or other colonial countries. So the ideas were implicit or something was pronounced openly, something was just was meant between the lines. Otherwise openly it was said that about open difference in mentality of European, Caucasian population and Asians, although this dispute which they didn't want to promote still came up to the surface. At least in the Kalkaus project. The main author of this was Andrei Kaczynski, the Moscow-based architect who were there after big earthquake, like Corbusier, who was roaming around the coast of Caspian Sea. He was he had very special deep vision of local architecture. And the local interpretation, his interpretation of local architecture was positively perceived by local party leadership, especially that they were clinging and working in the national styles at that time. I had already a chance to analyze the works of Kaczynski, like Corbusier, and his time tried to imagine the old town as a museum, theatralized, where around, like the backdrop, we have new big high-rises with observation platforms. In the context of today's conversation, I'd like to add the following. In Kalkaus project, it's evidently articulated that the dwellers of the old town, like Oriental people, have different mentality, different from Russian mentality. That's why they need different type of housing. And let me quote what Kaczynski wrote that time. What's the difference of the dwellings of Orient from north or west? In Russia, people always lived within four walls. That's why when they were located in high-rise buildings, simply these small huts were put one upon another. So basically, no big change in the lifestyle happened. In the East and the Orient, they don't live in houses. They live in the backyards, in the courtyards. That's why when we chase the Oriental person into the house, we drastically change his traditional lifestyle. It's the end of the quote. I always view this discourse as the evident division of people of the North and Orient. and definitely there is certain historical connotation, like geographical division of Asians and Europeans. But I would insist that this is the only aspect we're dealing with. Otherwise, we certainly hue of segregation. In the mid-70s, it becomes evident that despite providing the citizen with quadruple meters and separate apartments, well, these buildings do not carry out the main socialist function. Well, micro-regions do not become the labs of new social activities of the people. Well, and the, space, well, seems like, specially put tall ship buildings, and this commonality became either hidden, and it's quite evident in the films after Khrushchev's film from Dinara Kasar to Marlene Kusev's works. And what's interesting, if when Corbusier firstly attended, Kasbah in Egypt, well, compared Europeans with Reds, then could see, well, compares them with the border collie dogs or collie dogs who live in their apartment like in dogs in kennels. And that was also well demonstrated in the recent curator's project of Victor. Well, Kalkau's project, well, really, like avant-garde concerts of 20s, well, offers the way out. Well, the authors rely upon already the bloc community, calling them communist emahalam. So first they're offering just to discard, the Soviet streets concept and return to the streets of the Venice of social life, and also they return to monetarism just by fixing certain big spaces with certain groups of people. And the Mahatma concept, well, is offering just common, green spaces with shared, watering. So if you look at this, we see here we have the blocks of floors. So on these vertical levels, we already see the yards or kind of gardens belonging not to the whole block, but just to the dwellers of this specific group of apartments. And that was the way of combining collective and private, and still leaving some space for further development of the Soviet project. Although Alkau's project was never implemented, still we may say that some of its ideas were caught up by other Tashkent architects. In particular, in construction, building this monolith 16-story building, well, the architects returned back to separate individual green backyards. And so the completion of this building was done by the perestroika years, and the idea of being together didn't work, so it didn't bring around collective optimism. So these collective jokes eventually were slammed to collective garbage and waste, and were not used for collective, festivities or special occasions as it was initially planned. So the architecture in the Soviet society wasn't a generator, but the means of total dissemination, probably due to the state's overall total control and distribution of goods and benefits. Also, another aspect of this Kalkaus project is that where the author Albert Kosinski offered for development in Volgodonsk. You see, the whole idea was brought from the Orient to the West. And this transfer only confirms that historical vocabulary used in Middle Asia was definitely conventional to a certain extent. What was explained by Uzbek mentality in Russia takes the character of universal privilege. Otherwise, the attestment of this type of buildings, on the fringe of the empire in the Orient, now returning back to the center of the USSR. And it should be said that it's quite typical for modernism in general, because such shifts in discourse were following, conceptualization of modernism everywhere. And here I want to illustrate it with two examples. For example, connection between 12 genesis of houses in East and West Germany made them totally identical, but the urbanists from both sides of Germany totally differently interpreted. In West Germany, they were talking about generating private personal space for each family, where they could hide from, this, faceless industrial world. And in the East Germany, they were stressing the fact that socialist migrants were just kind of manifesting flourishing of collective lifestyle. Or another example for Soviet architecture crisis, same commentator talking at the Joint Architectural Congress back in 1958 in France. He could make a declaration about the unity of targets and tasks of architects of socialist countries. And at the meeting of the All-Union Conference, he was insisting that social, impetus of Soviet and Western architects are totally different. So in the distance applied to the Middle East, it became even more plastic, resonating with this pronounced search for a universal. So I hope this my kind of sketchy escapades, exemplified by Ramble cases, still quite representative to make the following resume. Lately, we hear a lot of talk about local modernities. For example, let's think about George Schönhammer and his long playing project, or an exhibition of multiple modernities in Pompidou Museum, which just recently closed, Nicolas Durieux project, or a project dedicated to Russian modernity deployed by the new literary review. These are all different in interpretation of our understanding of modernity and attempt to transfer a Western experience to other parts of the world. But also should get in mind, local modernists never existed in an isolated way. They were developing the framework of the common field, and mutual influences were so strong and so much, mutually penetrating, that now it would be probably would be more appropriate not to review single modernity, and the decentralization of viewpoints and also expanding its scope contains lots of opportunities rather than analyzing local stories. And first of all, it may enhance decolonization of our perception of modernism, rather than suggest many times described its Western, pedigree, origin, what doesn't mean automatically its applicability to other parts of the world. Thank you.
You make a very, very convincing case that this architecture is very much sort of part of a wider colonial story. But of course, the kind of great paradox of this is, is the Soviet Union's kind of combined position as inheritor of the Russian Empire and attempting to be a kind of post-colonial empire, or the kind of affirmative action empire, in Terry Martin's phrase, right? So you have the kind of encouragement of Black American writers, for instance, sort of coming to Central Asia, like the poet Langston Hughes, who spent several months in Central Asia in the early 30s, and sort of said, and ends up kind of arguing with Arthur Koestler and sort of saying, you don't understand why the real achievements of the Soviet Union, because you don't understand that they've got rid of Jim Crow. And I guess my sort of question is really about whether or not this was either a successful post-colonial experiment or a very, very successful colonial experiment. I mean, apart from perhaps this, I suppose, the Almaty demonstrations in the late 1980s, apart from that, the degree of pressure of sort of anti-colonial movements in Central Asia seem to be extremely minimal. I mean, by comparison with the Baltic states of the Caucasus, the Central Asia appears to have had the least kind of aspiration to break with the Union of any area in the Soviet Union. Down to the fact that in the March 1991 referendum, the highest votes by far to maintain the Union come from Central Asia. So would you regard that as a sign of the success of this project as a colonial one, or possibly the success of it as a sort of non-colonial union? Because it just seems, I don't know, it just seems such a paradox that you can't compare it directly with something like Algeria, because through all of the time when these Algerian projects are taking place, there is a huge anti-colonial movement in Algeria, and there is a huge amount of violence directed at Algerians by the French government. And it just seems, I know where you're coming from, and I think lots of these things are parallel, but there are really significant differences, and I wondered if you could talk about them.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Really very deep, very interesting questions. It's a very deep, serious, theme, which I'm afraid I simply don't have enough time here to respond properly. But the overall idea of mine is the following. In this case, we cannot compare situation in Algeria with the situation in Middle Asia, simply because, of course, Middle Asian situation didn't contain such a strong anti-colonial opposition, so there was no colonialism. So in the 60s, when we had the massive, transformation of Asian cities, it was preceded by a most horrible period of 1930s, and there was no comparable period in the Algerian history, despite all the horrors of Algerian war at the end of the 50s, early 60s. Still, the country, Algeria, did experience such horrible, horrendous events. So if we perceive and take the events of 1930s, like, manifestation of oppression of any dissonanting voice coming from the population. We simply didn't know the opinion of this population. That was a classical, silent, colonial subject. Well, definitely other opinions also may have place. At least when Andrei Kaczynski, it was probably the first case when the architects interviewed and consulted with the local population, and somehow he managed to put together the range of opinion, just the total palette of responses if they want to relocate and move in multi-story buildings. I think that there wasn't unanimous answer of no, but we can only guess what kind of feelings and emotions they were going through. In the framework of the Soviet situation, paradoxically, the menu of choice at a certain time was much more restricted and limited, even compared to the post-colonial situation in Algeria, when the local population already had a vote and right of voice. Thus, well, summarizing my answer, I want to reiterate that kind of speculative talking, this Soviet policy combined in a very specific mix of post-colonial and colonial aspects. Well, the local population participated in decision-making process only to the extent that some of the planning architects were originating from the local places, but they all been enrolled and shaped up through European education. So it's really hard to claim that they were parts of the total process. They were imposed already prefabricated decisions. So there were three layers: colonial, subcolonial, and certain features of Soviet project, which was not realized. It was kind of outlined beyond certain framework, but it had never been implemented to its full.
I want to pose the other example from Africa was in Casablanca. Casablanca is a part of the Siam explorations on modern cities in southern countries. Would you claim that the Casablanca ideas, as you have shown them, as following the Siam researchers, that Siam researchers has a colonial aspect, or what I missed in your speech was the connection between colonialism and modernization?
Ну, здесь есть у нас главный эксперт по Касабланке в мире, я считаю.
Да. Между других городов. No. About Casablanca and Algiers, and I'm responding also to you, Owen. I think it's really interesting to realize that the people who initiated the policies you've discussed in this very interesting parallel, both in Morocco and in Algeria, were anti-colonial activists. So the people who commissioned the specific housing, Muslim, Jewish, European, were opposed to French rule and were imagining, and they wrote specifically about it, that they were working for a future independent Morocco. This took place around 56 years because the effective liberation of Morocco. And talking about Pouillon in Algiers, the projects were made, these buildings were made for a mayor who was against French domination and who stayed in Algeria after independence. So these objects are very conflictual and contradictory. They were made under colonial rule, but by people who had an anti-colonial position. And then they were discussed on the world stage at the CIAM, at the International Congress of Modern Architecture in Aix-en-Provence in 1952, published by Gideon Allison and Peter Smithson, and became an extraordinary example, and I'm returning to your conclusion, of a new position inside the modern movement against the idea of a universal modern paradigm in favor of specific cultures. And it's really interesting to see how these inputs are inserted into the Soviet discourse.
Thank you very much for your commentary. Yes, I would add that here definitely we find lots of contradictions, true in a certain unique aspect, well, activities of François Pouillon and of Group 10 in Morocco expressed kind of leftist liberal ideas, liberation from colonialism. But I want to underline that the opinion that was some other way of restoring of colonial situation was expressed by some local communities, and local people were accusing them in a new form of paternalism, and sometimes they claimed that this new form of paternalism was even more dangerous than previous straightforward colonialism. So we can look at this dilemma from different sides and find every time find very interesting new fringes. Well, thank you very much for your very interesting report. Well, specific comparison allows us to see more visibly that the history of post-war architecture is very tightly intertwined into the history of states, which start implementing different geographies. And this aspect, I have a question concerning the Soviet version of this process. I was really interested in your statement when the space between individual buildings was considered as the collective public spaces, although in the primary sources, we heard more that any type of collective life could happen only within the walls of institutions and offices. So what practices were coded and fixed in the architect source of that period concerning these concepts? Well, first of all, I must correct myself if I was not very clear. I said on the contrary. So the spaces, gaps between buildings were not coded as collective or public spaces. Maybe that's how they were contemplated by the architects. Maybe you could find it in the comments, but in reality we all understand nobody perceived these spaces as collective or common spaces. They really were thinking about as kind of, as divided, taking away space, nobody's place. And in architectural theory, in conceptual ideas, I'm not familiar with any meaningful text. If we're talking about comparing it with the late 20s, and here we're really dealing with some kind of conceptual desert, perhaps not just without reason, because I think much of this work in the later Soviet time had stopped because the architects were internally prepared rather for accepting of a kind of a bourgeois city with this, division for private and public. I'd like to respond to comments of Alexander. Well, besides offices and in the administrative buildings, there was always such a concept as children's playground, and our work with Alexander Sverdlov had demonstrated that though in the big cities like Moscow and others, such common places or public places were mostly treated and perceived as nobody's land, so nobody cared for them, that in smaller towns people really treated them and perceived them as kind of public places. So certain shift towards such ideas really was there. The project was not completely implemented, but well, there were certainly good reasons.